Welcome back to COMM 350. In this lecture, we will be going over Mass Culture Theory 1.0. So let me start with a bit of an explanation. Mass Culture Theory 1.0 isn't a theory that you will see in most media studies textbooks. That's because this is an important background kind of conversation about some of the ideas that influence and shape media theory. You see, the theories that approach media began to be talked about in relation to how people view society and the relationship between humans and society as far back as the 17 and 1800s. So what we're going to be going over in these next two units on mass culture theory is looking at some of these theories about the relationship between people and the products they produce, as well as how people see the relationships within society and who should have the right to produce media and have their voice included in public debate. So Mass Culture Theory 1.0 is like the backstory or the prequel, as it were, to media theory. So keep that in mind as we go on. So what I'm also going to be doing in this lecture is giving you a little bit of an overview of how the pattern of all the lectures will go in COMM 350. So we'll start out each session and each lecture with going over briefly the key terms of Mass Culture 1.0. By going over, I mean I'm going to mention them and make a few comments, but I'm not going to go over them in detail. As you know, there are keyword videos that have been created for each of these set of terms, and I encourage you to read the materials in the class, as well as go over those videos before you begin the lecture. It will make a lot of concepts much more understandable, as well as I don't take a lot of time to define these terms in the lectures, and so having a clarity about those terms before you start through the readings and through the videos will be very important. So in this unit on Mass Culture Theory 1.0, we look at the terms civilization and culture. So this is how different ways and assumptions about how society is formed and functions. We'll look at the term mass culture and the group of people that it involves and connects to. The idea of minority culture, which is a different kind of framing of the way that we use this in the 21st century of the idea of a minority group or minority culture. And then we're going to go over Walter Benjamin's ideas of reproduction aura and how that relates to the production of art, and how art is representative of production of culture, and culture is representative of key ideas and values in societies. So these are some of the core terms that we'll be exploring in this lecture. So we're going to start each lecture with a theory context section, but this is where I'm going to go over a lot of the history and background ideas of that particular theoretical approach we're looking at. So today we're going to be looking at the history of ideas behind mass culture theory, particularly the 1.0 version, or the first initial version of how culture and society were identified and defined within the majority culture. So Mass Culture Theory 1.0, a little bit of the background. The first thing we need to know is that this is a theoretical approach that sees a very hierarchical view of society. So if you're not sure with review hierarchy means it's a very kind of structured way of seeing the world, and an assumption that there's certain different groups of people, and those groups have different values. So some groups are seen as having more value, so more voice, more resources access to them. Others will have less. And so the idea, especially at this time, was that you were kind of born into a certain class of society, that will both define kind of the opportunities you had, your economic potential, the kind of resources you had, your access, and also the value that you were seen to by all of society. And so that hierarchical view of society, very structured, very bounded, very controlled, is where kind of some of these assumptions about people and culture began to emerge. So we're going to talk about those roots. So some of this idea, and especially this thinking about how we see culture, was first emerged in what was during the 18th century and the 17th century as the majority media. And that was the media of text and literature and art analysis. So we see some of these ideas coming forth from scholars and authors who wrote in literature and art analysis. And they began to talk about the idea of mass culture, which is culture produced by the masses or all of humanity, and then how that should be evaluated. So Mass Culture Theory 1.0, often its roots are connected back to this man, Matthew Arnold. And he had a very kind of cultured view of society, where he felt that as his role as a art and a literature critic, that he needed to kind of define what is good culture. Part of his job or that he had was kind of evaluating the how texts were written, how stories and novels were written. And so this kind of, he felt kind of gave him some kind of expertise in order to say what is good in literature. And so he felt important to call out what culture was, because he said there's this thing, what he called culture, this cultivated language and ideas and expressions. And then what he began to see is what he called anarchy, or just the other, as it were. So in his work on literature analysis and mass culture, we see these kind of two things: of culture as a positive value, and anarchy and this other kinds of production as a negative. So he had concerns of that for the work of Arnold came out of his of the Protestant business mindset. He saw, especially in the 1800s, with the production of cheap paper and the production of not just cheap novels being produced, but kind of newspapers emerging, that these kind of that writing and literature was becoming accessible to the everyday man and woman. Which we would probably in the U.S. think is an important idea. But him looking at kind of Europe at that time was kind of concerned about this Protestant business mindset, this mass production, and the rise of industrialization of the with society, and the Industrial Revolution was creating this new class, the middle class. So up until this point, there have been basically two kind of classes, well, three classes of society. It was the king or whatever ruler there was of the particular area. There was the aristocrats, or basically people who were of the higher aristocracy. They had money, they had land, and they had connections to the king or the queen, and so that they had kind of power and influence. And then there was everybody else. And so, basically, it was very easy to keep control in society because it's a very small group of people. Well, with the Industrial Revolution, what we see is people building factories, and that rises this new middle class. And so he saw that basically novels and newspapers were becoming very popular among people. And that was taking away kind of, from the whole kind of select authors could produce novels. You had to have connections, you had to have money in order to do that. And so he saw the increasing importance of novels and newspapers in society was kind of undermining this very kind of controlled production of who could produce novels, stories, and what were the stories we wanted to tell. And he, in his work, is kind of well known for this idea of distinguishing between what he considers high class and low class. And what's interesting is, he says high class is this educated minority, and low class was basically everybody else. And his idea was that, they're the only people who are educated, and especially have the power and authority, the minority, this aristocracy, or the people with wealth, should be the ones that kind of call the shots, but should also be the ones to decide what is good and what is bad in literature. They have this kind of role, is to kind of culture, to nature, to parent the masses that were seen as kind of unlearned, unrefined, and unable to kind of produce things of quality, or things that had the values that they would choose to expose. So this idea of kind of mass culture in this very hierarchical society, in this very class-based society, and very kind of control limited, is something that, well, we in the U.S. May often, especially in 21st century, have a hard time understanding. And that's because many of the people who of our founding fathers and mothers who came to the U.S., they had a very they were trying to push against what they saw in Europe as this very class-based society that basically excluded certain people from public discourse, and to be for being producing things of value. And one of the best ways, I think, to understand kind of this idea of high and low culture, and what mass culture 1.0 and then 2.0 was trying to push against, is the Enola Holmes movies. They came out in 2020 during the pandemic. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these movies in lecture 1 and 2 to give you a bit of a framework to understand kind of the society that where Matthew Arnold was writing, and what this elite culture of society and produce this high and low culture kind of distinction. So a little bit of background to the Enola Holmes movies. Enola Holmes is supposedly the sister of Sherlock Holmes, who was a famous detective. And in the story, we hear the story of her life, and how she was her raising, which was quite different from her two older brothers and with her mother. Um, so she basically was raised by her mother, who was very an independent woman and taught her interesting things like boxing, and she taught her to read and explore nature and to identify bugs and animals and and whatnot. And so her education was not in a formal schooling. It was from her mother, who was very educated. And so she had this very different approach to society. Even though her family was kind of the aristocracy, they had land and they had wealth. It wasn't the kind of the traditional upbringing that young woman would have at that time. At that time, a woman might be sent to boarding school, and she would learn things like how to make tea and how to needlepoint and crochet, how to prepare a home for dinner parties and whatnot. What were the clues and cues of proper society? Enola Holmes and her mother are both pushing against this in this film, and so we see a lot of these distinctions coming out. So one of the things I encourage you right now in the lecture is to pause the video and to watch the trailer to Enola Holmes. You can either watch it through the link here, or you can copy and paste this link, or just Google in YouTube Enola Holmes 1 trailer. And so, if as you watch this trailer, I want you to pay attention to kind of what you see as the kind of different structures in society, and how Enola and her family are both fitting into that model of an aristocratic family and pushing against it. So if you watch the Enola one's trailer, you'll see kind of a theme kind of coming out of Enola Holmes. She is this kind of, uh, a young woman who is challenging the traditional social rules and structures. She's always being chided by her eldest brother, who, like, she's not wearing a corset, she's not doing her hair, she doesn't know how to do needlepoint, she's not following the certain social rules that she's supposed to of a family of their kind of economic and historical standing. And we also see that kind of, her mother, who she's kind of lost, and then she refines in the movie, is also one of these people that she's campaigning for women's rights, and she's also campaigning for workers' rights to votes. So we see kind of Enola Holmes just showing this very clear class distinction. We see kind of some people from the aristocrats in this film stepping into the role of kind of being advocates for the masses, the mass culture, which is all the totality of everyone in society. And we also see people kind of upholding it. One of the kind of storylines also we come at in this movie is that Enola meets this young Lord Tewkesbury, who, again, he's from a family. His father has died, so he has inherited this title, the wealth of the family, and he is running away from his responsibility. But also, his father was this one of the aristocracy that believed that people in the minority should have rights and should have a voice. And his family, actually, some members of the family are actually encouraged or not trying to find him after he's run away, because they don't want him to stand for these beliefs of kind of promoting the mass culture in society. So what this kind of, and we'll go a little bit more into that later, but let's go back to kind of Matthew Arnold and how this relates. So Matthew Arnold, his one of the quotes that he is most credited for, and his definition of culture is this: culture is to know the best of what has been said and thought in the world. Culture is to know what is best and has been said and thought in the world. So again, his idea, again, writing as a literature critic, is that, if you are learned, if you have had an experience of having access to good art, good reading, and whatnot, you will know, you are the one who is actually able to define what are good values, to replicate them, and to promote them in society. So for him, this is kind of what his kind of goal is to promote the upper class and their values and their voice. He wrote in his well-known book, Culture and Anarchy, this kind of division of culture is from the elite. Anarchy, he defined as the prevalent mood of England's then new democracy, which lacked standards and a sense of direction. So he was concerned about the things that we kind of see in the Enola Holmes film. He sees in the 1800s about the campaigning for both the women's right to vote, but more importantly, for workers' rights. And that it used to be at that time only people who were a lord or a lady could go vote in parliament and have a voice about what the rules and the governance of the country was about. And he saw that these people that were trying to kind of let the majority class or majority people have a voice. So men, they wanted to have men who had access to education, or that had that all they wanted to let all men that to have a voice in society. So this move away from the values and the control of the ruling class was something he was basically his motivation for writing this book and pushing against. And this is important because again, the primary media that day was, literature, art, and whatnot. And these newer media of cheap novels that could be bought, in the street or in corner shops, as well as newspapers, were kind of pushing against the control that the elite had over not just media, but ideas. So going back again to Enola Holmes, we see two pictures here. One is this is Lord Tewkesbury's grandmother, and she represents this ruling class. These ideas and values of that there's only certain people in society that should be able to produce ideas and communicate them, and especially as producing art. Enola in this whole film is kind of pushing against in very vocal way about that. Hey, that we need to advocate for everyone, and also me as part of the aristocracy. I don't want to reproduce these ideas and values. That there's more perspectives in life than just the one that you were brought up with, in you being Sherlock Holmes. So the high culture is what's represented by the Tewkesburys and the Lord and Grandma. She is the culture of the elite. And this is the idea that cultivated expertise to create and consume should be left to those people with, again, with money, with resources, with connections. Low culture, and sometimes called popular culture, was the culture of the working class, the everyday man and woman. And so it was about making accessible that culture. They were making culture that's accessible to everyday people. So, high culture, what is high culture versus low culture? Well, high culture would have been referred to those kind of the creative arts, those things that took a lot of skill, a lot of resources, a lot of money to produce. So high culture would be things like art, paintings, sculpture. Not everybody could get access to those pigments and those kind of materials that you would need to make. They would also kind of see classical music. So you had to have training in the violin or the bassoon or the flute, and that took access to resources to buy those instruments as well as to learn them and cultivate them. So high culture was referred to those forms of culture associated with elite and dominant classes, things that required expertise, things that a few people had access to, and things that would be elevated for what they produced. Popular culture was also being produced at this time period, but these were things that be for open to the masses and let anyone could kind of produce. So things like folk art would be things like hand carved dolls and paintings. It would be things like cross stitch or crocheted, kind of, samplers that would kind of communicate maybe a well-known a verse, but instead of being made out of fine linen, it might just be made out of some muslin and some cotton that they had put together. This would be like the songs that people would write that tell about their lives, everyday lives, versus the fine cultivated sonatas and pieces that would be played in the orchestra or in the opera house. And so we see this kind of distinction of high and low culture coming out of the ideas of Arnold, of his idea of there's culture of the minority culture, and the majority culture is where anarchy exists. So at this point in the lecture, we're wrapping up the first section of the lecture on the background of Mass Theory 1.0. At this point, I'm going to do a check-in, and you'll see me doing this in the lectures. These check-in points are points for you to kind of say, hey, do I really understand the information that's come before? What do I really need to be soaking in, understanding, and knowing? And so if you don't, I encourage you then either go back and listen to the video of the lecture again, and or get out the readings to be able to read those alongside to make sure you're understanding. So here, check-in, at this point, you should be able to explain, can you explain the difference between high culture versus low culture. So what is the difference between the two? Who produces them and who controls them? And how does this kind of hierarchy create a certain kind of culture and a set of expectations? And what does this culture say about the media?